Hi, everybody. Hope we're all doing well. Good to see you again. I'm just going to start by sharing the screen. And here we go. Hope you've all been doing well. And today, I'm going to talk about a scene that happened in New York City, in Manhattan in particular, in 1861. And it was something that was happening all over New England, as well as the Union is mobilizing for war. And on this particular Saturday, September the 21st, Massachusetts military regiment with over 1,000 men were marching through the streets singing in praise of John Brown. Quote, in New York, thousands of private citizens, old and young, on the sidewalks and in crowded doorways and windows, were all celebrating Brown's noble death in the cause for freedom. So these singing soldiers and citizens were challenging conventional ideas of the Civil War. These stories here tell us that for the Union, the war for reunification was transformed into a war for freedom, not only with Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 63. In fact, it's clear in that even in the summer of 1861, these two meanings of the war were in competition with each other. So no military hero of the present war, the New York Independent wrote, has thus been honored. The question that was striking fear in a lot of Northern politicians and businessmen was, how is the war going to incorporate Brown's cause of freedom? Developments on the front were making the question difficult to deal with. And the Union already suffered some major losses. We have, what do we have? Bull Run, Wilson's Creek, earlier in September of that year. Seen another defeat at the First Battle of Lexington in Missouri. And the remainder of 1861 would lack major Union victories that the North could rally behind, and it was becoming clear that this war was not going to be wrapped up very quickly as initially hoped for. And unity among the remaining states in the Union was tenuous. And the New York Independent celebrated John Brown, a man that many claim was partly responsible for the war, and it cemented Northern fears about the purpose, duration, the course of the Civil War. And the Independence over-the-top conclusion was rather frightening to those who simply wanted a return to the antebellum status quo. And I've told you about the influence that abolitionists had on sectionalism, their determination to make their voices heard despite being a state fringe movement. And the war came, and Lincoln's response, more or less, was, let's bring these rebellious states back into the Union. He was obviously trying to hold on to what were the border states, but still making no statements about slavery if the Confederacy would be reabsorbed back into the nation, to the Union. So Lincoln and his administration maintained the Unionist message for more than a year. And on the other, his generals, including men like Benjamin Button, had to deal with the realities. Button made Fort Monroe in Virginia a locale for runaway enslaved people. And Lincoln's cabinet eventually decided not to reprimand Butler. The question of what to do with the captured or fleeing enslaved people became impossible to simply avoid or sidestep by the fall. Debates about slavery and enslaved people went on through the following summer, and when Major General John C. Fremont proclaimed that enslaved people in Missouri were free, Lincoln said that, quote, the liberation of slaves was objectionable, and Fremont was quickly removed. He was removed from his command. Lincoln's difficulties addressing the topic of slavery spoke to the stakes of his decisions in the court of public opinion, during the build-up to secession and in wartime. So the questions are, was this war going to be fought for freedom or to preserve the Union? And intervening 150 years of gradually somewhat obliterated how separate these concerns were at the war's outset. And it was really only during Reconstruction that the cause of slavery of war were wedded so inextricably to the war's eventual byproduct, which was emancipation. This is an image here that you can imagine would strike fear in the slave-holding South. Look at the probably formerly enslaved people marching in the street, following behind Union soldiers. They are armed. They are cheering. There are ruins, probably of a southern city, right behind them. And 6 months after Fort Sumner, these issues were so hotly debated that the Union effort seemed threatened not merely by the surprisingly capable and Confederate forces and their victories, but by the battle over abolition and its place in the Union fight. So how could the remaining states of the Union prevail if they were so divided over the issue of freeing enslaved people? There's always there to stir up more trouble. This now recovered Charles Sumner, he was always ready for a fight. He leapt into the headlines with a speech at the Republican State Convention in Worcester on October 1st. And the title of it was Emancipation, Our Best Weapon. And trying to transform the war for Union into a war of abolition, conservatives fear that Sumner would draw out the war and be a disaster for the Union effort. And Northern newspapers tried to explain things. This was not a war for abolition. This is an article after article came out citing resolutions of the House, President Lincoln, and Lincoln's Secretary of the Interior named Caleb Smith, explaining the government's position in August of '61. He said, quote, "My friends," he told an audience, he was speaking in Rhode Island, "we make no war upon Southern institutions," that means slavery. "We recognize the right of South Carolina and Georgia to hold slaves if they desire them. But, my friends, we appeal to you to uphold the great banner of our glorious country and to leave the people of that country to settle those domestic matters according to their own choice and the exigencies which the time may present." And a war for Union, the war that Lincoln and his government were fighting, would preserve the bargain struck by, quote, our forefathers. In the same issue, the Herald, the newspaper, wrote of the administration under siege, quote, "misapprehended and misrepresented by the extreme anti-slavery party of the North, just as much as it is by the extreme pro-slavery fire eaters at the South. Both one and the other persist in representing that the object of the government is to destroy the institution of slavery." The Herald declared it, quote, "a seditious abolition conspiracy against the government." Unionists argued that abolitionists, quote, "endeavored to induce the North to secede and were delighted when the South saved them from any further trouble by seceding for itself." So the abolitionists had caused the war at this point. And when secession did not end slavery, quote, "necessity invented for the abolitionists a better mode of accomplishing the object to which they had devoted their lives. And that mode was by using this war as a means of abolition, by making it a war of emancipation." And while William Lloyd Garrison had always theatrically claimed that the Union was a dead letter anyway, and the Constitution, quote, "a devil's pack dripping with blood," it is hard to argue that these fanatical men single-handedly brought on secession. But as for making the most of that circumstance, clearly Garrison and the Liberator, that was his newspaper, you might remember, led attempts to turn the Civil War into a war of emancipation. Garrison's paper reprinted a piece by Charles Godfrey Leland Leland, Leland, that explained the abolitionist approach. Leland, a unionist, wrote frequently for the pro-union magazine Continental Monthly, and eventually enlisted in 1863 and fought at Gettysburg. He said, quote, "This war is destined sooner or later to effectually abate this nuisance of slavocracy by removing the cause." Leland explained in 1861, quote, "Why not plunge in and settle it at once? Go at it bravely and be done with it." So he's just saying, let's just say this is about slavery and get it over with. And Leland's urge to settle the question of freedom bravely and immediately would never win over an embattled union. Lincoln and his cabinet and his underlings would continue to reject an emancipation vision of the war for several more years, no matter what songs the Union troops sang, what realities materialized at the front. And the process that we'll observe over the course of 1862 is how Lincoln became converted, at least to emancipation as a military strategy. But we want to keep in mind that this question about whether the Civil War was and would always be a war not for abolition. Part of Lincoln's willingness to change his mind, his tune regarding enslaved people and slavery itself was how brutal the war was becoming over the next year. The war was bloodier and more bitter than anyone could ever have imagined. And as we go forward from here, we will trace out the major military campaigns of this year of 1862, and always with an eye toward the incredible swing of morale behind the lines in the North and in the South, as the two sides won victory North, and we'll look at Confederate invasions of Kentucky and of Maryland in 1862, which presented Lincoln with yet another set of extremely difficult challenges. Excuse me. And as we continue, we'll consider the impact of this increasingly drawn out long war on the home front in the North and in the South, and especially with respect to both sides' decision to conscript or to draft soldiers. We'll talk about this as evidence that the war was moving beyond a level that anyone thought was possible at its outset. So, the Confederate offensive, invasions, as it says on the top here. So in the wake of, there was major victories that we've spoken of in the East at the 7 days battles, the Second Manassas or Bull Run, whatever you want to call it, in August of 62. The Confederacy mounted a broad strategic counteroffensive in fall of 62. The tide had turned in a major way. In June of 62, General McClellan was close to Richmond, which remember was the capital of the Confederacy. U.S. troops had scored several major victories in the West, and many thought that the war would end within a few months in 1862, and obviously they were wrong. Things had completely changed by September of 62 when Robert E. Lee advanced into Maryland. So Lee is in Maryland, and why would he go into Maryland? What was he hoping he could accomplish in Maryland, which was Union territory, his first time in there? And he didn't want to give up the initiative. He had the upper hand, which they had held since the Second Battle of Bull Run. And Lee believed firmly in the idea that one should keep their initiative and keep the other side guessing, maybe, make them respond. Take action, make them respond. Get more favorable conditions, balance out disadvantages. And obviously, Lee armies are difficult to feed. They need a lot of things, they need a lot of resources. So Lee decided they could go into Maryland and he could find provisions for the army in Maryland. maybe Pennsylvania. He'd pull out, he could pull the army out of the war-torn Virginia and live off Maryland. He had hoped to influence Northern politics with this move as well. It's a known fact that Lincoln was in a delicate political position, especially in the wake of these large defeats in the summer of '62. There were congressional elections coming up that fall, and a big victory on Northern soil might push Republicans out of power, get Democrats who would be more sympathetic to the South into power. In Maryland, Lee thought that the people of Maryland might rally to the Confederate cause if he could score a big victory there. And the Confederates thought and hoped that Maryland and Kentucky were being held in the Union by force. And Lee also was considering Europe. A big victory in the North would probably impress European powers and potentially sway them behind the Confederacy. Another victory might convince them that it was time. Of course, we're mainly talking about England and France here. Here comes the Battle of Antietam. 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 Lee moved across the Potomac into western Maryland in early September of '62. And part of his army was under the command of Stonewall Jackson. Moved in and captured they captured a federal garrison of 12,000 soldiers. McClellan was the Union commander, again, put back in charge by Lincoln after a Bull Run to help the army regroup. McClellan had the good fortune of capturing Lee's entire strategic blueprint in this campaign. He was always very cautious with his moves. He did not take steps to capitalize on this, and he moved very slowly, very carefully, very cautiously. And the result was that Lee had time to reunite different parts of his army before Cleveland could capitalize. The two forces clashed in western Maryland in the Battle of Sharpsburg, or Antietam. They have two names, remember, on September the 17th, 1862. And it proved to be the bloodiest day of the war, and actually the bloodiest day in all of American history. Antietam, September 17th, 1862. It was an enormous battle with constant swings, momentum that saw 23,000 casualties after one day of fighting. Lee remained on the battlefield the next day, but then retreated back into Virginia. And he did so without having accomplished much of what he set out to do. Still, Northerners did not see this as a great victory for the Union. And Lincoln was especially annoyed. Once again, McClellan did not follow up his victory and let Lee get away. He had an opportunity to follow Lee. His forces totaled around 80,000, and Lee was closer to 35,000. McClellan's army, though, had suffered enormous losses due to desertion and straggling as it went north. Lee's army suffered losses due to desertion as they moved further north. And there had been many casualties in the campaigns earlier in the summer. This was a tremendous lost opportunity, though, for the United States to pursue the retreating army. Braxton Bragg was in the West. Confederates mounted an offense into contested border state territory in the West as well. They're in the West. And in Kentucky, under General Bragg, in September and October of 1862 is when they're there. So, there's motives here. That would be Bragg also hoped to gather supplies. He hoped to win back some of the losses that the Confederacy had suffered out in the West, and he thought the Kentuckians would rally to the Confederate standard to the cause. He took the time to install a Confederate governor in Kentucky. In a ceremony that it was a ceremony that they kind of made make believe that this guy was actually now the governor of Kentucky. And then there's Perryville. It's a campaign that came. This campaign out west and came to a climax in Perryville in October of '62, October 8th to be precise. And the battle was a stalemate. It was not nearly as bloody as by civil war standards, at least, but it was another one that didn't really have a clear victor. But since Bragg was not able to produce a decisive victory, he, like Lee in Maryland, was forced to retreat back into Confederate territory. And this was the last time that a major Confederate army posed a threat to Kentucky. And just like McClellan, though, in the East, the Union general in Kentucky, his name was Don Carlos Buell. I think Buell. Well, he did not follow up and try and capture and destroy as much of Bragg's army as he could have. And there's implications here is like, how important were these autumn campaigns? What is there to make of them? Well, militarily, they certainly appeared to favor the Union, and neither the Confederacy counteroffensive had yielded any military advantages. Not really. The fact that McClellan nor Buell pressed their success limits to the degree to which we can call these big victories. People in the North, especially Lincoln, were extremely disappointed, and the people in the South did not view them as huge disasters as their armies were able to withdraw and not captured. Diplomatically, Antietam was a big success for the US because Lee's failure at Antietam convinced the British, who were considering intervening on behalf of the Confederacy. They did not. They were considering, working out some sort of peace, maybe a mediator, perhaps. But we'll get to that a little bit later on. The British backed away from the Confederacy is the point here. The British backed away, though not just because Lee had retreated, but equally more importantly, perhaps, is because Lincoln used success at Antietam to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation on September 22nd, 1862. And with this proclamation now on the table, the character of the war can quickly change, especially in the eyes of Europe. It placed the United States officially on record as being against slavery. France and England had both abolished slavery years before this. And this made it difficult for London. The issue of slavery made it difficult for London or Paris to side with the Confederacy. These campaigns were not great military watersheds. The Confederacy is still ready and willing to keep fighting. The Union had not yet scored a decisive victory, but there are some important things we can take away from their victories. It proved that Lee was the main man in the Confederate Army. He was the general, and most Confederate military efforts in the West had been rebuffed. Lee and his army of Northern Virginia had stood out as the main source of good news and progress for the Confederacy, military progress. And Lee and his army were very much like Washington and the Continental Army during the War for Independence, at least in the eyes of the CSA. CSA is what I'm saying. Most important national institution there, really. The institution to which people in the South looked for inspiration, even more so than the government and politicians. But also these campaigns were important for these diplomatic reasons. It staved off any European intervention. And Lincoln was still looking for reliable military leadership. He changed generals once again. He fired McClellan and Dwell and put in new commanders. And he got rid of Well first. I need to find out if that is how to pronounce this person's name. And he didn't get rid of McClellan, though, right away, not until the day after the elections of November of 62, those congressional ones that we were speaking of a little bit earlier, because McClellan was a popular Democrat, and firing him may have cost him Republican votes. So we're going to wrap it up there, and we will continue later on.